for you to just share about what are the five character types and how do they relate to the ways that we work our energy, and maybe frame them not just from the kind of pathological side, but also, what's the positive potential in each too.
Yes, because each one of the character types has a gift. And the good news is that when they learn to dissolve the defense patterns, they don't lose the gift. That gift is already developed. So, in these five types, they relate to five stages of childhood and getting wounded in any of these stages. So, the first type is called the schizoid, and a more positive um, name would be the creative, the spiritual one. This is a person who is not terribly embodied, but because of that, has a real connection to the spiritual world. They might channel other entities or have psychic visions or really be into meditation. You see a lot of them in yoga centers. They also can be very intelligent. They can go into, things like computer programming where you're working with a lot of abstract ideas, academia, research. And often they're very creative. They're artists and musicians. And so they're highly intelligent. And that is one of the gifts. They go up into their head, so their head is developed, their intellectual capacity is developed. And where their growth is learning to come down into the body. But because the spirit is big and the body is contracted, when they try to get into the body, it's almost like they don't fit. It's like a pair of jeans that's way too small. So by expanding the body, we can make room for the person to drop down in and be more present. And this is a wounding that occurs right as you're coming into your body at birth, the first few months of life. Do you get touched and held by your parents? Do you bond well with your parents? Do you feel safe? And if that goes well, you wouldn't have this pattern. But if something doesn't go well there, then you might develop the schizoid pattern and contract into your core. The next one is generally called the oral pattern. And you can also think of them as the giver, the lover. On the Enneagram, if you know that, it would be the two, the caretaker. They're always giving their energy away and taking care of people. And they're wonderful people to be around. They make great therapists and teachers. And and parents, they love to be there for their children. They give a lot. And so that's their positive quality. They don't have a big need for boundaries. They're very open-hearted. Sure, bring everybody over for dinner is the kind of thing an oral would say. But the shadow side there is that they do give their energy away and they deplete themselves, that they don't have good boundaries and they can get overextended and overwhelmed. And in terms of life force, they don't have a lot of it in their body, mainly because they're giving it away. And the wounding comes from not getting enough as a child. For the schizoid, the wounding is, I'm not sure I have a right to be here. But for the oral, it's, I didn't get enough. It could be food, it could be attention, it could be holding, it could be guidance. Can be the neglected child, the child that has to, share life with too many brothers and sisters, and the mother doesn't have time. And so the oral structure needs to learn self-care, turning that energy back on the self, having better boundaries, um, finding their worth within themselves rather than their worth in what they give to people. But they won't lose that gift of being generous and kind and perceptive of other people. So that's the oral character structure. The next one up is wounding in what I would call the third chakra stage, which is when a child is developing their autonomy, their personal will. It's the me, mine, I want to say no kind of stage that a child goes through that we know is often very difficult for parents. And how this stage goes has to do with whether a person gets the wounding that classically, and this is a more pathological name, is called the masochistic character structure. I find that's too pathological, and I call it the endurer character structure. And the reason being is this is the type that is very loyal, and they can endure. They can take on the hard job. They can show up every day for work. They're dependable. They're quiet. They don't ask too much. They're sort of like the person in the background that is just, sort of carrying the load and not complaining and not being too big or too loud. and just sort of shuffling along. And, like I say, they're very reliable, they're very solid, they're very grounded, they know how to ground down into their body. The shadow here, or the tragedy, in some ways, each one has a tragedy, is that they're not very happy and they don't feel very alive because, in order to endure whatever it was they had to endure in childhood, they had to numb themselves. And so in the body, they tend to thicken the body as if thickening the distance between the inside and the outside, like putting on another coat and another coat. And, you just have a thicker layer. And that slows down the movement of the life force, it numbs the sensations. And so this type is prone to kind of a melancholy or a depression and not really realizing that they have options in life. So they kind of live life as a series of have tos. I have to do this, it's Monday, I have to do that. And they don't really recognize that they have choices. They just sort of put up with things. And that wounding is, around 18 months to 3 years. Then the next level of wounding is really in the heart chakra. And this is a child who perhaps had everything that he or she needed in the early stages. And then when they get the impulse control that you gain in third chakra, they use that impulse control to shape themselves in a way that they will be liked or loved or approved of or popular or, in the good graces of the parents. And, a certain amount of that is fine. We need to develop that. But this wound comes from very conditional love. And that conditional love, says, I don't love you for your real self. I love you when you perform. I love you when you do things right. I love you when you follow the rules. Oh, you're such a good boy. You're mommy's favorite. You do everything just the way I tell you. And so we call this the rigid. And actually, the wounding here is about 3.5 to 5. The rigid, follows the rules. They're high charge. They're high energy. They're the ones that keep everything neat and clean, and they make sure all the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted and the forms are filled out, and they always look well and they have, pretty good bodies. And their tragedy is they are out of touch with their authentic self. They don't feel like they have the right to have a shadow, to have any messy parts, to have feelings even. And so that rigidity masks the feelings. And then, of course, for the rigid, when they come into relationship, they relate from their persona, from their performance self, rather than their inner self. And they don't get the satisfaction of real intimacy. So they can, only go so far into relationship and they go, well, I'm not getting what I want. But then they do the same strategy in the next relationship. And then the final one, which is actually a little bit younger wounding than the rigid, it would be the late stage of the third chakra, which is power. And this is a child who did get to have their will. They did get to have their power. And they got a sense of their separate self. And for whatever reason, they were betrayed in some way. It could be a child that was used by a parent. It shows up often in, not always, but often in sexual abuse or violence in the family. And this is a child that doesn't go to being meek and cooperative. They go more to being the rebel. They go more to, I'm going to be powerful and I'm going to lead and I'm going to take charge and nobody's going to tell me what to do. And they are actually very good leaders. They make great CEOs. They make great politicians sometimes. And I would say most politicians have a good dose of this that is classically called the psychopath. I call it the challenger defender. I think that we don't want to, there's a lot of people with this structure that are not what we would call a psychopath. They're not deceiving. But there is a sense that this
some
type
people don't take kind to be called the psychopath, so I think it's good to have a little balance there.
Yeah. And I call it the challenger defender because they will defend the meek. That you want to hire them as your lawyer. They'll defend and make sure you win the case. But when challenged, they get very defensive themselves and they can turn white hot anger against you. So, if you get one for a lawyer that fights for your case, don't challenge him on the bill.